There is a moment, less than 1 second long, that ended the Imperial Japanese Navy. 10:22 in the morning. June 4th, 1942. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 55 years old, was standing on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 300 miles northwest of Midway Island, when he heard a lookout scream a word that no Japanese sailor had ever needed to scream in 6 months of war. Dive bombers. Nagumo looked up, and in the sunlight above his ship, he saw 33 American SBD Dauntless bombers already halfway down, wings level, engines shrieking, bombs still in their racks, falling straight at him from 14,000 feet. He did not have time to give an order. He did not have time to speak. He had time only to understand, in one breath, that his hangar decks below were crowded with aircraft being rearmed, that his fighters were not where they should be, and that in the next 15 seconds his flagship was going to die. 6 minutes was all it took to doom them, not to sink them, to doom them. By morning, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 3/4 of the Imperial Navy's carrier strength, were on the bottom of the Pacific. That night, alone, in a borrowed cabin aboard a destroyer, Vice Admiral Nagumo whispered a question. He whispered it once, then again, then again. His staff heard him, his aides heard him. How did they know? How did they know we were coming? This is the story of the answer. This is what Japan's admirals said as their empire ended. For 6 months, they could not lose. From the strike on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 through the spring of 1942, the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sailed across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean the way a hammer moves through glass. 4 fleet carriers at its core. Akagi, the flagship. Kaga, larger still. Soryu and Hiryu, faster. Newer 248 aircraft on their decks. Zeros, Vals, Kates. The pilots who flew them were the most experienced carrier aviators in the world. Some had more combat hours than the entire American carrier pilot corps combined, and the man who commanded them was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo was a career officer, small in stature, quiet in manner, a man who wore his rank the way an older man wears a coat that has fit him for many winters. He was not a pilot. He had never flown a combat mission. His whole career had been built in torpedo warfare, in destroyer flotillas, in the slow ladder of promotion through torpedo staff and cruiser command. He had reached the top of the Imperial Navy, not by taking risks, but by not making mistakes. And now he commanded the most powerful carrier force ever assembled by any nation on Earth. He knew it did not fit him. Before the Midway operation sailed, he had confided in his air operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant young planner who had drawn up the Pearl Harbor attack. "Why me?" Nagumo had asked. "I am a torpedo man." Genda had said nothing, because there was nothing to say. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, seniority chose commanders, and Nagumo was senior. 300 miles behind Nagumo, aboard the giant battleship Yamato. The man who had planned all of this was watching from his flag bridge, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The man who had studied at Harvard in 1909, the man who had served as naval attaché in Washington in the 1920s, the man who had walked through American factories and counted American oil wells and told the Prime Minister in 1940 that Japan could rampage across the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, and after that, he could promise nothing. He had said it. And he had planned Pearl Harbor anyway. And he had planned Midway anyway. Because in the Imperial Japanese Navy, an admiral did not refuse a war his nation had chosen. Beside Yamamoto stood his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, a lean man with a scholar's face who kept a private diary he called the Sensoroku, the War Chronicle. Every day, Ugaki wrote down what Yamamoto said, what Yamamoto did, and what Yamamoto's face looked like when he did it. Ugaki's diary would survive the war. Yamamoto would not. And on the fourth carrier, on Hiryu, 40 miles from Nagumo's flagship, the third admiral of this story was pacing. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 50 years old, commander of Carrier Division 2. Yamaguchi was everything Nagumo was not. He was young for his rank. He was aggressive. He had studied at Princeton in the 1920s, and he had read the Americans the way Nagumo had never bothered to. Before the Midway operation, Yamaguchi had argued that Japan should sortie with all 6 of her fleet carriers, not 4. Overwhelming force. Destroy the American fleet in one blow. He had been overruled. Now he stood on the bridge of Hiryu, and he watched the horizon, and he waited. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, in the grey light before sunrise, 108 aircraft rose from the flight decks of the WWII. 36 Kate torpedo bombers loaded with land bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Zero fighters flying escort. Their commander was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, flying from Hiryu. His mission was to strike the American installations on Midway Island and clear the way for the invasion force following 100 miles behind. 93 more aircraft stayed behind on the 4 carriers. Kates, armed with Type 91 torpedoes, Vals loaded with armor-piercing bombs. The reserve strike, the one that would launch if American carriers appeared. But no American carriers were expected. Japanese intelligence had reported that the American Pacific Fleet was still recovering from Pearl Harbor, that Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, that Enterprise and Hornet were somewhere in the South Pacific, thousands of miles away. The WWII believed it was sailing into an empty ocean. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a message came back from Lieutenant Tomonaga over Midway Island. A second strike is required. Nagumo read the message on the bridge of Akagi. He looked at the sky. He looked at the reserve aircraft parked below on the hangar decks of his 4 carriers, loaded with anti-ship weapons for an enemy fleet that was not there. And at 7:15 in the morning, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo made the first of 3 decisions that would destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy. Rearm the reserve, he ordered. Take the torpedoes off the Kates. Take the armor-piercing bombs off the Vals. Load land bombs. Prepare a second strike on Midway. Below decks, ordnance crews began the slow, dangerous work of unhooking Type 91 torpedoes from Kate torpedo bombers, rolling them across steel decks on trolleys, and stacking them against the bulkheads, because there was no time to return them to the magazines 4 decks below. 13 minutes later, at 7:28, a signalman handed Nagumo a second message. It was from a reconnaissance float plane. Number 4 Scout, from the heavy cruiser tone. 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted bearing 010 degrees. Distance from Midway, 240 miles. Nagumo read it once. He read it a second time. His face did not move. The officers on the bridge later said they had seen him look at reports for years and had never once seen his expression become so still. Where, he asked, are their carriers? No one answered. because no one knew. Antone's number 4 Scout should have launched at 4:30 in the morning with the rest of the Kido Butai's dawn reconnaissance flight. But it had not. Its catapult had failed. A mechanical problem. Something small. The aircraft had sat on its cruiser's deck for 30 minutes while crewmen worked on the launcher. It had lifted off at 5 o'clock, 30 minutes late. If Tone's number 4 Scout had launched on time, Nagumo would have known at 7 o'clock in the morning that an American task force was 240 miles from Midway coming for him. He would have known before he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed. Instead, at the moment the report finally came in, the hangars of the Kido Butai were open. Torpedoes lay stacked against bulkheads. Ordnance cuts stood in the middle of steel floors. Fuel lines were unspooled. In a cabin below the bridge of Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda lay burning with fever. He had been sick for 3 days with pneumonia. When a staff officer brought him the news of the American ships, Genda pushed himself up on one elbow. His face was flushed and wet. "What types?" he asked. "Unknown," the officer said. Genda closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he spoke. "If there are carriers, we must launch now, even if only the aircraft already armed can go. Launch them. Now." But Nagumo did not launch. He waited. Because waiting was what the manuals said. Because Tomonaga's Midway force was still airborne, still returning, still needing to land. Because Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had built his career on not making the wrong decision, and the wrong decision this morning seemed to him to be the fast one. At 7:45, the third message came from Tone's number 4 Scout. 5 cruisers, 5 destroyers, no carriers. Nagumo exhaled. The officers on the bridge exhaled with him. He turned to his operations officer. "Rearm with torpedoes," he said. "Prepare to attack the enemy surface force after recovery of the Midway strike." Below in the hangars, the crews reversed their work a second time. The land bombs came off. The Type 91 torpedoes went back on. Nothing had been stowed. There was no time to stow anything. At 8:19 in the morning, the fourth message came from Tone's number 4 Scout. The enemy force appears to be accompanied by what looks like a carrier. Appears to be what looks like. The bridge of Akagi went silent. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the commanding officer of the flagship, stepped closer to Nagumo. "Admiral, if there is a carrier, we must launch immediately." "With what?" Nagumo answered. His voice was flat. "Half our aircraft are still returning from Midway and must land. The other half are being rearmed for the 3rd time this morning." "What am I to launch?" He gestured through the bridge windows. Below on Akagi's flight deck, returning Val and Kate bombers from the Midway strike were coming aboard, one after another. Tomonaga's own Kate, its left fuel tank shredded by American ground fire and leaking a rainbow of aviation gasoline behind him, touched down last at 8:30. Tomonaga climbed out of his cockpit. His flight suit was black with oil. 40 miles to the east, on the bridge of Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi read the team reports Nagumo was reading. And then he did something that no other admiral in the Kido Butai would have done. He picked up a signal lamp and sent a message directly to the flagship. "Recommend immediate launch of attack force." Yamaguchi had aircraft ready. On Hiryu's deck, at that moment, 18 Vals and 9 Kates were fueled, armed with the right ordnance, and could be in the air in 20 minutes. He did not care that the strike would be incomplete. He cared that somewhere over the horizon, an American carrier was launching aircraft at him right now. "Get planes in the air," his message said. "Strike before they strike you." Nagumo read Yamaguchi's message. He read it twice. He considered it, and he made his decision. He would wait. He would recover Tomonaga's aircraft. He would complete the rearming. He would launch a full coordinated strike. It was what the manuals prescribed. It was what a career of avoiding mistakes had taught him was correct. 2 admirals. The same reports. 2 opposite orders. Somewhere to the east, 151 American carrier aircraft were already in the air. At 9:18 in the morning, the first American aircraft appeared on the horizon. They came in low, 50 feet above the water. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Hornet, flying in a loose V formation. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron from Fort Pierre, South Dakota, 42 years old, a father of 2 daughters who had written to his squadron the day before that if only one plane made it through to strike the enemy carriers, he wanted that man to do it and to go to hell. They had no fighter escort. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo watched the lookouts point. "Torpedo bombers," someone shouted. Nagumo raised his binoculars. "American, low, Usla, coming straight in without fighters." He almost smiled. Above the Kido Butai, 30 Zero fighters were flying combat air patrol at 15,000 feet. Their commander tipped his wing, and 30 Zeros rolled onto their backs and dove. What happened next was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Waldron's squadron never had a chance. The Zeros hit them from above and behind. The first Devastator went down burning, one wing torn loose. The pilot dead at his controls. The second exploded in midair. The third cartwheeled into the sea. Waldron himself was seen standing up in his cockpit, waving his men on, before his own aircraft caught fire and vanished in a spray of white water. In 8 minutes, all 15 Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot into the Pacific. Not one torpedo hit its target. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, floating under a seat cushion in the middle of the Kido Butai, lived to see the sunset. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo turned to his staff. "American torpedo bombers," he said. "Poor coordination. No fighter escort. Ineffective." He was correct. Nagumo could not have known that the failure was the point. At 9:25, 14 more Devastators appeared from the east. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, was still recovering from a crash landing 2 weeks earlier that had put him in sick bay for a week. He had refused to be grounded. He led his men in low, and the Zeros came for them, and 10 of the 14 Devastators fell into the sea. Lindsay was among the dead. His torpedoes missed. At 9:35, 12 more Devastators appeared from the north. Torpedo Squadron 3, from Yorktown, the carrier the Japanese believed they had sunk a month before at the Coral Sea. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, was killed. 10 of the 12 Devastators went down. His torpedoes missed. 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked the Kido Butai in 17 minutes. 35 had been shot down. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. Nagumo turned to Captain Aoki. "Continue rearming," he said. "We will strike them once Tomonaga is aboard." And 40 miles to the east, on the bridge of Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi lowered his binoculars and said nothing. He had watched the torpedo attacks the same way Nagumo had watched them. But something in Yamaguchi's silence was different, because Yamaguchi, unlike Nagumo, had noticed one thing that Nagumo had not. The Zero fighters were down at wave height. Every single one of them, all 30, chasing the last of the devastators across the Whitecaps at 50 feet above the sea. And the sky above the Kido Butai, at 15,000 feet, where the combat air patrol was supposed to be, was empty. At 10:20 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., the air group commander of the carrier Enterprise, was 175 miles from his own ship, 40 minutes past the point of no return on his fuel, and lost. McCluskey had 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers behind him. He had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. The coordinates Enterprise had given him were empty ocean. The Kido Butai had turned north, and no one on Enterprise had known. McCluskey's Dauntlesses had enough fuel to search for another few minutes. After that, they would have to turn for home, and many of them would not make it back to the ship. And then, in the ocean below him, he saw a wake. A single Japanese destroyer cutting a white line across the blue Pacific at high speed, heading northeast. Its name was Arashi. An hour earlier, Arashi had been dropping depth charges on the American submarine Nautilus. Arashi had held Nautilus under until she was sure of her kill. Then she had turned northeast to rejoin the carrier force at flank speed. She was, in that moment, the fastest ship in the ocean, pointing straight at Vice Admiral Nagumo's flagship. McCluskey looked at the destroyer. He looked at his fuel gauge, and he made a decision that would decide the Pacific War. He followed her. At 10:22 in the morning, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived over the Kido Butai at 14,000 feet. They looked down, and what they saw was every dive bomber pilot's dream. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in loose formation on a calm sea, decks crowded with aircraft, wakes drawing straight lines, not a single fighter in the air above them. McCluskey picked his target, Kaga, the largest carrier, dead ahead. He assigned Akagi to Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron. Best, an intense, thin-faced pilot from Bexley, Ohio, 32 years old, misread McCluskey's radio call and started his dive on the wrong ship. He caught the mistake in mid-air, hauled his Dauntless out of formation, and rolled toward Akagi, with only 2 other aircraft behind him. 3 Dauntlesses aimed at the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, each carrying a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. They pushed over into their dives at 70 degrees. On the bridge of Akagi, a lookout was scanning the sky through binoculars. He turned his head, saw a black shape in the sun, and his mouth opened. Kyukoka Bakugekiki. The word came out as a scream, "Dive bombers!" Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo turned his face to the sky. He saw them, wings level, bombs still in their racks, engines shrieking, falling out of the sun straight at him. He did not have time to give an order. He did not have time to speak. He had time only to understand. The first bomb from Best's Dauntless missed by 20 feet, exploding in the water alongside Akagi's starboard side, throwing up a mountain of white spray that rained down on the flight deck. The second bomb struck amidships. It punched through the wooden planking of the flight deck. It punched through the steel of the upper hangar deck. It exploded among 9 Kate torpedo bombers whose Type 91 torpedoes had been reloaded onto them 40 minutes earlier and which had not been fueled. The torpedoes went off in a chain reaction. The hangar filled with flame. The third bomb struck near the aft elevator. The elevator collapsed. Aviation gasoline lines, unspooled and pressurized for refueling operations, ruptured. Fuel sprayed across the burning hangar deck like water from a hose. Every fire door on the ship failed at once. In 6 seconds, Akagi went from an aircraft carrier to a torch. On the bridge, Nagumo did not move. The deck under his feet shuddered. Smoke came up through the elevator shafts and boiled against the bridge windows. Sailors ran across the flight deck below him with their uniforms on fire. The public address system was dead. The fire mains had lost pressure. The engines were still turning. A staff officer took Nagumo by the arm. "Admiral," he said, "we must transfer your flag." Nagumo did not answer. 1,000 yards to starboard, Kaga was already dying. 4 Dauntlesses, under the command of Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, had dove on her at almost the same moment McCluskey's men had dove on Akagi. The first bomb hit Kaga's forward flight deck. The second landed among the parked Val dive bombers just aft of the island. The third detonated the aviation fuel tanks on her port side. The fourth broke her back. Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, was killed instantly when the second bomb exploded on the bridge itself. The bridge structure collapsed. The senior surviving officer on Kaga was a lieutenant commander who had been on the flight deck. He looked up at the burning bridge and understood that everyone above him was dead. Kaga's flight deck disappeared in flame. Farther to the north, Soryu was dying too. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3, had arrived over the Kido Butai from a different direction at almost the exact same moment as McCluskey. 3 of his bombers struck Soryu with 1,000-pound bombs in less than a minute. Soryu's flight deck peeled open like a torn envelope. Her hangar erupted. Her captain, Ryusaku Yamamoto, walked out onto the port bridge wing, drew his sword, and refused to leave. 6 minutes. That was how long it took. 6 minutes for the American Navy to change the Pacific War. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo finally spoke. "Where is Hiryu?" he said. An officer answered. Hiryu was undamaged. She had been separated from the main formation earlier that morning. The American dive bombers had not found her. Nagumo nodded slowly. His face was without expression. "Signal Hiryu," he said. "She is to launch all available aircraft, attack the American carriers immediately." Captain Aoki appeared at his side. His face was streaked with soot. His uniform tunic was torn open at the shoulder. "Admiral," Aoki said, "I will remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue to direct the battle." "The battle," Nagumo repeated, as though he had never heard the word before. He looked at Aoki. He looked at Kaga, burning furiously on his starboard side. He looked at the column of smoke on the horizon that was Soryu. 3 carriers gone in 6 minutes, his flagship dying under his feet. And the man in front of him was asking him to continue. At 10:28, Nagumo climbed down the ladders of Akagi's island. Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka led the way. The passages were filling with smoke. Sailors carrying wounded men stepped aside to let the Admiral pass. On the flight deck, forward of the fires, a rope had been rigged over the side to the destroyer Nawaki. Kusaka went down the rope first. Nagumo hesitated at the rail. He looked back at Akagi one time. The ship he had commanded to Pearl Harbor. The ship he had led across the Pacific. The ship that had carried the honor of the Imperial Japanese Navy for 6 months of unbroken victory. She was burning from stem to stern. Kusaka called up from the destroyer, "Admiral, please." Nagumo took the rope. He climbed down hand over hand. When he stood on the deck of Nawaki, He did not speak. He turned once and looked at Akagi, and a young ensign standing near him, who lived to write about it after the war, said that the admiral's face at that moment was empty. Not grieving, not angry, not afraid, empty. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first message at 11 o'clock in the morning. A communications officer walked into the operations room with a message slip. He handed it to the admiral. Yamamoto read it. He read it a second time. He took off his glasses. He folded them carefully. He set them on the chart table. "All 4, he said. 3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning," the officer said. "Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu is undamaged and is launching a counterattack." Yamamoto did not move for a long time. Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, was standing 3 feet to his right. In his war diary that night, Ugaki wrote that in those 10 seconds, Admiral Yamamoto aged 10 years. Yamamoto sat down heavily in a chair. He did not speak for several hours. On Hiryu, 40 miles from the burning wrecks of her 3 sister ships, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi was already at work. The news of the disaster reached him at 10:30. His response took no time at all. "Launch everything," he said. 10:54, 18 vowels and 6 zeros rose from Hiryu's flight deck. Their commander was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raid. His squadron flew east. At 12 o'clock, they found Yorktown. The same Yorktown the Imperial Navy had believed sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yorktown's Wildcats came up to meet them. They tore through the escort. Kobayashi's aircraft was hit and fell, burning into the sea. 7 valves broke through. 3 bombs struck. Yorktown's flight deck erupted. Her boiler uptakes were ripped open. Her speed fell to 6 knots. But the Americans on Yorktown were not finished. Damage control parties, veterans of the Coral Sea, patched her boilers with steel plate and mattresses. Within an hour, she was making 19 knots. Her flight deck was patched. She began to recover fighters. On Hiryu, Yamaguchi received the report from Kobayashi's surviving pilots. "We have struck 1 Yorktown-class carrier," they said. Yamaguchi nodded once. "Now the torpedoes," he said. At 1:30 in the afternoon, 10 Kates and 6 Zeros rose from Hiryu. Their commander was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. Tomonaga was the young officer who had led the strike against Midway that morning. He had returned to Hiryu at 8:30 in an aircraft leaking fuel from a shredded left-wing tank. The tank could not be repaired in the time available. The strike would use every drop of fuel he had in his 1 remaining tank. He would not have enough gasoline to fly home. Tomonaga did not argue. He put on a clean flight suit. He walked to the ready room. He wrote a short letter. He walked to the flight deck. Before he climbed into his cockpit, Tomonaga stopped in front of the officers who had come to see him off. He did not say much. He looked at each of them. Then he saluted, and he climbed in, and he closed the canopy, and he took off, and he flew east. He never came back. By the time Tomonaga's Kates found the American task force at 2:43 in the afternoon, Yorktown had been patched, repowered, and was steaming at 19 knots on a smoke-cleared deck. Her decks looked whole. Her wake looked strong. She looked, from 12,000 feet, like a different smooch. Like a second Yorktown-class carrier that had not been touched all day. The Kates came in low, splitting into 2 groups. 5 got through. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side. The carrier that had refused to die at the Coral Sea and had refused to die from the Val attack 90 minutes earlier, now died. Her engines stopped. Her rudder jammed. She listed 26 degrees. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, gave the order to abandon ship. Tomonaga's aircraft did not return to Hiryu. The surviving Kates flew back to Yamaguchi's flagship with their reports. "We have struck a second Yorktown-class carrier," they said. "It is dead in the water." Yamaguchi allowed himself, for the first time in 6 hours, a small moment of satisfaction. 2 American carriers hit. 2 carriers, perhaps, sunk. If Hiryu could launch one more strike before darkness, the battle might yet be reversed. 3 Japanese carriers for 2 American victory. But it was not the disaster of the morning either. He did not know. There was only one Yorktown. Kobayashi's Vals and Tomonaga's Kates had struck the same ship twice. The pilots, unable to see the ship's name from 12,000 feet, had reported a fresh target each time. Enterprise and Hornet, the 2 American carriers Yamaguchi believed damaged or destroyed, were both untouched, and their scouts had spotted Hiryu at 2:45 in the afternoon. At 5 o'clock, 24 Dauntlesses arrived over Hiryu at 19,000 feet. Half of them were from Enterprise. The other half were from Yorktown, whose pilots had taken off before their carrier was crippled and now had no home to return to. Below them, Hiryu was steaming at 28 knots on a calm sea, her flight deck once again crowded with aircraft, her captain and her admiral standing on her bridge. The Zeros saw them coming and climbed. They could not reach them in time. On Hiryu's bridge, Yamaguchi looked up. According to the account of one surviving officer, recorded after the war, the admiral spoke a single word, "Yararataka." So they got us. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in 10 seconds. The forward elevator platform was blown clear of the ship. It cartwheeled through the air and slammed against the bridge structure like a 200-ton shutter. The hangar deck exploded. The fires spread aft. Within the hour, Hiryu was burning as fiercely as her 3 sister ships had burned that morning. At sunset, Yamaguchi called his surviving staff onto the flag bridge. Captain Tomeo Kaku, the commanding officer of Hiryu, stood beside him. Kaku was 50 years old. He had commanded Hiryu since her commissioning. He and Yamaguchi had served together for 3 years. Gachi looked at the officers of his staff. "You will all transfer to the destroyer," he said. "You will continue to fight. That is my order." He turned to Kaku. "You do not have to remain," he said. Kaku did not answer. He simply stayed where he was. Yamaguchi understood. He nodded once. The staff officers protested. Yamaguchi silenced them with a raised hand. 3 carriers are gone this morning," he said. "I commanded Carrier Division 2. Soryu was under my command. I did not save her. Now Hiryu will follow. It is not right that others should die and I should live." He turned to the young officer of the deck. "Bring water," he said. A small tray was brought up to the bridge. On it were 2 cups of clear water. Yamaguchi and Kaku raised the cups. They drank. They set the cups down. The staff officers were led away. Some of them were weeping. Survivors' accounts, Yamaguchi and Kaku tied themselves to the cup stand. The truth of that last moment went down with the ship. At 9:12 in the morning of June 5, 1942, the aircraft carrier Hiryu rolled onto her port side and sank into the Pacific Ocean. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 50 years old, went down with her. By dawn on June 5th, the numbers were final. Kaga had sunk the evening of June 4th. Soryu had gone down at 7:13. Akagi, still afloat but beyond saving, was scuttled by Japanese destroyer torpedoes at 5 o'clock on the morning of June 5th. Hiryu, 4 hours later, 248 aircraft on the bottom, 3,057 men, and the ability of the Imperial Japanese Navy to project power across the Pacific Ocean. On the deck of the cruiser Nagara, alone in a borrowed cabin, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo sat in a chair and stared at a bulkhead. Officers came in with reports. He answered them. Officers went out. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him. They did not move. Once during the night, a young ensign passed the cabin door and heard the admiral speaking quietly to himself. "How did they know?" he was saying. "How did they know we were coming?" The answer to Nagumo's question was 7,000 miles away, in a basement. Beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor, in a room that had no windows and no name on the door, a Navy lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort worked a 20-hour shift in a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers. Because his uniform hurt his feet, Rochefort was 42 years old. He had learned Japanese in Tokyo in the 1920s. He had spent every day of the last 5 months in this basement with a team of 30 men, breaking the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code. The code was called JN-25. It was supposed to be unbreakable. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team had broken enough of it to see a shape, an operation, a large one, aimed at a location the Japanese were calling by the code letters AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Island. His superiors in Washington did not agree. Rochefort proposed an experiment. He had the Midway garrison transmit in the clear that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, a Japanese intercept referred to a water shortage at AF. AF was Midway. By the end of May, Rochefort had given Admiral Chester Nimitz the date of the attack, the composition of the Japanese force, the intended landing beach, and the approximate location where the Kido Butai would launch its aircraft. Nimitz took every American carrier he had. He put Enterprise and Hornet and the crippled Yorktown patched up in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, when she should have taken 3 months, into the ocean northeast of Midway. And he waited. On the morning of June 4th, when Tone's No. 4 Scout finally sent its delayed report of 10 American ships 240 miles from Midway, those ships had been sitting in that exact position for 2 days, waiting for Nagumo, reading his mail. The Kido Butai had not sailed into a battle. It had sailed into an ambush. Aboard the battleship Yamato, at 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto broke his silence and gave the last order of the operation. "Occupation of Midway is cancelled," he said. "All forces will withdraw." Ugaki wrote in his diary that night that the commander-in-chief looked, in that moment, like a man signing his own death warrant. Ugaki was not wrong. The combined fleet turned west. It sailed home in silence, without carriers, without honor, and without any illusion that this war was still theirs to win. Yamamoto did not leave his cabin for 2 days. The ships came home to Japan in the last week of June. The wounded were unloaded at night. The surviving sailors of Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu were placed under armed guard on an island off Kyushu. They were forbidden to write letters. They were forbidden to speak of what they had seen. Some of them were held for more than a year. The Imperial Japanese government announced that the Battle of Midway had been a glorious victory. Japan had lost according to the official communique, 1 aircraft carrier. The American Navy had lost 2. Most of the Japanese Army did not learn the truth until 1945. Most of the Japanese people did not learn it until after. The 4 admirals, whose voices this story has followed, did not survive the war. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi went first. His body went down with Hiryu at 9:12 in the morning of June 5, 1942. He was 50 years old. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo went home to a nation that had told itself he had won a battle he had lost. He was quietly reassigned. He was given the command of a training fleet. He was given the command of a garrison. He was given, in the end, the command of the Central Pacific area, headquartered on the island of Saipan. In the summer of 1944, the Americans came for Saipan. They came with 4 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 68 destroyers. They came with 50,000 Marines. On the second day of the invasion, they broke through the Japanese lines. On the third day, they cut the island in half. Nagumo was 60 years old now. He had a command post in a cave above the town of Garapan. On the 6th of July, he received the last reports from his subordinates. The Americans were 300 yards away. The garrison had run out of ammunition. There would be no relief. Nagumo asked his staff to leave the cave. They protested. He told them the order was final. When they had gone, according to his aide's later account, he sat down at a small wooden table. He wrote a short note. He took his service pistol from his holster. He put the muzzle to his temple. He pulled the trigger. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the Kido Butai, at Pearl Harbor, at Darwin, at Colombo, and at Midway, was 57 years old. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not live to hear about Nagumo. On the 18th of April, 1943, 10 months after Midway, Yamamoto boarded a bomber for a morale inspection tour of the Japanese air bases in the Solomon Islands. His itinerary was transmitted to those bases by radio, in code, 4 days in advance. The code was JN-25. Joseph Rochefort's successors read it the same day. Admiral Nimitz asked Washington for authorization. Washington gave it. 16 American fighters flew a level intercept mission across 400 miles of open water on the morning of the 18th. They arrived over Bougainville at 9:34. They found Yamamoto's aircraft exactly where the intercepted schedule said it would be. They shot it down. Yamamoto's aircraft crashed into the jungle. His body was recovered the next day. He was still strapped into his seat. A Japanese report said his hand gripped the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Whether that was true, or whether it was what his nation needed to believe, no one could say. He had died of 2 bullet wounds. He was 59 years old. The same code that had killed his fleet at Midway had killed him. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki survived them all. He kept his diary until the very last day of the war, the Sensoku. He wrote in it the night of the Midway defeat. He wrote in it the night Yamamoto died. He wrote in it through every reversal, every retreat, every burning ship, every burning city, every atomic flash. On the 15th of August 1945, when the Emperor of Japan announced the surrender of the empire over the radio, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, promoted twice since Midway, was the commander of the 5th Air Fleet on the island of Kyushu. He listened to the broadcast. He put on a clean uniform. He took the ceremonial short sword that Admiral Yamamoto had given him before the war. He walked out to the airfield at Oita. Young pilots trained for suicide missions were waiting for him beside 11 aircraft. Akagi climbed into the rear seat of the lead plane. The pilots took off. 3 turned back with engine trouble. 8 flew on toward the American fleet at Okinawa. They never arrived. Somewhere over the East China Sea, in the last hours of the last day of the war, all 8 aircraft went into the ocean. Akagi's final diary entry, written before he left the runway, said only that he was going to the place where he could apologize to the emperor and to those who had died before him. He was 55 years old. Commander Minoru Genda, the air officer who had lain sweating in his fever cabin aboard Akagi and begged Nagumo to launch the ready aircraft the moment American ships were reported, survived the war. He surrendered his sword at the end of the war. He died in 1989, at the age of 84, in his own bed. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the commanding officer of the flagship Akagi, who had asked Nagumo for permission to remain with his ship and go down with her, did not go down with her. When Akagi was ordered scuttled at 5 o'clock on the morning of June 5th, Nagumo overruled him. Aoki was taken off by a destroyer. He watched his ship die from another deck. He returned to Japan. He was quietly retired from active command. He never spoke publicly about the battle. Late in his life, an interviewer visiting him at home asked what he remembered most about the 4th of June, 1942. Aoki was in his 70s then. He was a small man with white hair, seated in a chair beside a low table in a room that looked out over a garden. He was quiet for a long time. The silence, he said. After the bombs went off, there was a moment when no one spoke. We were standing on the bridge. Some of us were burned. Some of us were bleeding. The ship was on fire below us. We could hear the fires. We could hear the men crying out. But we ourselves did not speak. We stood and looked at one another, because what was there to say? We had just watched our entire strategy burn. That was the silence. That was what the Japanese Admirals heard at Midway. They had built the finest carrier fleet in the world. They had trained the finest naval aviators in the world. Their doctrine was clear. Their courage was beyond doubt. Their admirals had spent 30 years each in the service of the emperor. None of it mattered, because a lieutenant commander in a red velvet smoking jacket in a basement at Pearl Harbor had learned to read their mail. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, at 10:22, in 6 minutes of American dive bombing, the war that Japan had been winning turned into a war Japan could not win. And every man on the bridge of every burning carrier understood, in that first silence, that it could never be turned back. That is what Japan's admirals said as their empire ended. They did not say very much. They did not need to.